The crowd laughed before he even spoke. The lights in the studio beamed down like spotlights in a Roman Colosseum. But tonight's lion wasn't roaring. It was watching. Senator John Kennedy stepped onto the set of The Midnight Exchange, the most watched late-night talk show in America, greeted not by applause, but by sarcasm. The host leaned back in her chair, sipping from a mug with her own face on it, and smirked. "We have a very special guest tonight," she announced, her voice dripping with irony, "a man who still thinks TikTok is a clock and that Wi-Fi is a new brand of corn. Give it up for the one and only Senator John Kennedy." The audience erupted, not in celebration, but in laughter. Kennedy smiled faintly, not because he found it funny, but because he'd seen this game before. But no one in that room, not the crew, not the cameras, not even the host, had any idea what was coming. He took his seat with quiet dignity, hands folded in his lap like a man who knew exactly where he stood. The host didn't waste a second. "So, Senator," she said with mock warmth, "how does it feel to represent an entire state when most of your demographic still uses rotary phones?" Laughter again, sharp and rehearsed. Kennedy turned to face her, his gaze steady but kind. "Well," he said, his southern drawl deliberate and calm, "they also taught me that respect doesn't expire with age. But I'm sure you'll learn that one day." A low murmur rustled through the crowd. The host blinked, her grin tightening, and fired back. "Respect is earned, Senator. This is the real world, not some Norman Rockwell painting." Kennedy nodded. "That's true," he replied. "So let me tell you about the real world." He reached into his jacket and unfolded a wrinkled piece of paper. "This is a letter," he said, his voice firm, "from a 14-year-old girl named Ava in Louisiana. She wrote to thank me after our office helped her school keep its only science teacher from being laid off. Not because of politics, just because someone listened. She wants to be a marine biologist, but she couldn't name a single woman in science until last year." The crowd went still. Even the camera crew leaned in. Kennedy's eyes scanned the paper, then looked up. "She asked me if anyone would care about her voice. I told her I care, and I still do." The host shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clearly caught off guard. "Well, that's touching," she muttered, trying to reel the segment back toward comedy. "But this is entertainment, Senator. We're not here to—" "Feel?" Kennedy interrupted softly. "That's the problem. You can talk over people for ratings, but you can't drown out real life, not forever." The audience stirred again, this time with an uneasy hush. Kennedy turned slightly, now addressing not just her, but everyone watching at home. "You see, they brought me here thinking I'd be too slow, too old, too out of touch to keep up with the snark. But what they forgot is that kindness ages like wine, and ridicule, that spoils like milk." At that moment, the studio's energy shifted. The laughter was gone. The live chat on the screen behind the host began to flood, not with jokes, but with words like respect, powerful, and truth. And right here, right now, if you've ever felt talked down to because of your age, your beliefs, or the way you carry yourself, I want you to comment the number 9. Just type 9 if you believe dignity still matters. Like this video if you've ever wished someone would speak up, not louder but wiser. Kennedy wasn't shouting. He wasn't fighting. He was just standing tall. The host blinked twice, then looked down, not at her cue cards, but at her own hands. The camera didn't pan away. It stayed right there, on the stillness, on the quiet victory. Because the thing about storms is, they always pause before they pass. And in that pause, the world listens.
The silence on set was louder than the applause had ever been. The host adjusted her blazer, her carefully scripted charm unraveling thread by thread. Behind the scenes, a producer whispered nervously into his headset, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let the tension ride. But John Kennedy wasn't done. He leaned forward just slightly, not to attack, but to get closer, to make sure no one missed what he was about to say. "You invited me here to be your punchline," he said gently, "but maybe what you didn't expect was that people are tired of laughing at others just to feel big themselves." The host forced a smile. "Senator, don't take it personally. It's a comedy show. We roast everyone here, even celebrities." Kennedy tilted his head. "You don't roast people. You roast ideas. You roast power when it's abused. But kindness, experience, grief, those aren't jokes. Those are scars. And when you mock scars, you tell everyone watching to hide theirs." The audience, once raucous, now sat in rapt silence. Someone coughed. The host's face faltered again, reaching for her mug, taking a sip of water she didn't need. "Senator, this isn't Sunday school," she chuckled weakly. "We're just trying to have a little fun." Kennedy looked at her, not with anger, but with something far more disarming, understanding. "Fun isn't the enemy," he replied, "but cruelty wrapped in laughter, that's cowardice with a laugh track." Suddenly, a sound rose from the side of the audience, slow, deliberate clapping, then another. Within seconds, the room was filled with applause, not for a joke, not for a punchline, but for a man who told the truth like it mattered. The host blinked, visibly caught off guard. For a moment, she looked small, not in stature, but in spirit. And then the twist came. From the control booth, a young intern, barely in his 20s, posted a behind-the-scenes clip on social media. It showed the host minutes before the show, rehearsing lines designed to ridicule Kennedy. She laughed with producers, mocking his accent and age. "Let's go full viral," she said. "He won't even know what hit him." Within 15 minutes, the clip was on Twitter, TikTok, and Reddit, and it exploded. The hashtag #RespectKennedy started trending worldwide. People weren't just outraged, they were ashamed, not of him, but of themselves, forever finding that kind of cruelty entertaining. Sponsors began pulling out by the hour, comment sections filled with messages like, "We've had enough of this kind of entertainment," and finally, someone taught the media a lesson in grace. Meanwhile, Kennedy sat quietly in his green room, unaware that outside that studio a firestorm was building, not against him, but for him. Back in the studio, the host was handed a phone by her producer. Her face went pale. Ratings were spiking, yes, but not for her. They were tuning in to see Kennedy, his words, his presence, his calm. "Well, Senator," she said, forcing a laugh, "it looks like you've won over our viewers tonight." But Kennedy didn't gloat. He stood slowly, buttoned his coat, and turned to the crowd. "I didn't come here to win. I came here to remind people that you can be firm without being cruel, honest without being heartless. And sometimes the quietest voice is the one that changes the room." He looked back at the host, eyes soft but clear. "And I hope someday you'll use your stage to lift someone up instead of tearing them down. That's the kind of joke that never gets old." The audience rose to their feet, not because they were told to, but because something about this night had shifted the air, not just in the room, but across the country. 1 million people watched live, millions more would see the clips. But it wasn't the mockery they remembered. It was the moment a man refused to stoop and still managed to stand taller than everyone else. Backstage, as he gathered his things, a makeup artist approached him, tears in her eyes. "Senator," she whispered, "my dad watches you speak every Sunday on YouTube. He says you're the last person on television who still sounds like a real human being. I didn't get it until tonight. Thank you. Kennedy smiled, then nodded. "Tell him I said hi, and tell him to keep listening, because the world still needs voices that don't yell just to be heard." And with that, he walked out of the studio, leaving behind a silence far more powerful than any headline.
The hallway outside the studio felt like stepping out of a storm into calm daylight. But behind the glass walls, the tremors hadn't stopped. John Kennedy walked slowly, his polished shoes tapping against the tile floor, a soft rhythm that contrasted sharply with the chaos erupting online. A network staffer trailed behind him, phone pressed to her ear, whispering frantic updates into the void. "Yes, sir. Trending worldwide. Sponsors are already pulling segments. No, he didn't raise his voice once." Kennedy reached the elevator and pressed the button, his reflection staring back at him in the metal doors. He wasn't smiling, not even satisfied. He just looked still, like a man who knew he hadn't changed the world, but had managed to hold one small line in it. And that meant something. Meanwhile, back in the studio, the host sat frozen in her chair as the teleprompter continued rolling with jokes she could no longer deliver. She had built her brand on being unshakable, sarcastic, untouchable. But tonight, all it had taken to crumble that persona was a man with no script and a calm refusal to be humiliated. Her earpiece crackled. "Pull her from the second half," a producer said coldly. "Bring in the musical guest early. Damage control." She looked out at the now silent crowd and saw what no viral segment could fix. Faces turned not toward her, but toward the direction Kennedy had exited. Reverence, not rage. Curiosity, not clicks. Out in the world, it got worse. The behind-the-scenes clip had now reached 25 million views. A flood of comments surged in, people sharing their own experiences of being ridiculed for their age, their quietness, their values. One user wrote, "My grandfather cried watching that. Said he hasn't heard anyone speak with that kind of strength since Dr. King." Another said, "I thought I tuned in for laughs. I left with a lesson." And then came the third twist. An anonymous post emerged from a former writer on the host's team. It included screenshots of past scripts, detailed notes on which guests to mock and how to do it for maximum online engagement. The tone was clear. Manufactured cruelty had been a business model, and the public was done playing along. By the next morning, headlines exploded. "Senator Kennedy silences talk show host without saying a word too loud." "Kindness wins in a world that forgot it mattered." From laughingstock to leading voice, the night everything changed. But Kennedy wasn't reading headlines. He was sitting in a modest hotel cafe, alone, sipping black coffee, his leather folder open beside him. Inside was Ava's letter, the one he'd read aloud, and half a dozen others from people across America who'd written over the years. A waitress approached with hesitant steps. "Senator," she said softly, "I saw the video. I wanted to thank you, not for fighting back, but for not fighting the way they expected. My dad used to say, 'Never wrestle with pigs. You both get dirty and the pig likes it.' But you stayed clean." Kennedy looked up at her and gave a tired but warm smile. "Your dad sounds like a smart man." A few tables over, a group of college students stared at him, unsure whether to approach. One of them, a young man in a hoodie, finally walked over. "Sir," he began awkwardly, "we're all, kind of blown away. Like, we didn't even agree with everything you've said in the past, but last night, that wasn't politics. That was something else." Kennedy nodded. That was someone trying to be human in a place that forgot how. The student laughed. "Yeah, that. Exactly that." He walked away, leaving Kennedy alone again. But the air had shifted. Even strangers were talking slower, thinking more. Somewhere out there, The host was no doubt watching the empire she'd built on cleverness collapse under the weight of real meaning. Her sponsors were fleeing. Her publicist was spinning. Her apology statement had already leaked. But it felt hollow, a paragraph too late, a tone too fake. Because the truth was, no amount of PR could undo what people had seen. Not a man who destroyed her, but one who refused to destroy anything at all. That's what made it unforgettable. Later that day, Kennedy gave a short interview on the steps outside a community center. Not for a cable network, but for a high school journalism club. When asked how he felt about the viral moment, he simply said, "Being viral isn't the point. Being useful is. If the only thing people remember is that I stayed calm when someone tried to strip me of dignity, that's good enough for me. But I hope they remember more. I hope they remember that silence isn't weakness. It's just waiting for the right moment to mean something." He paused, looked into the young interviewer's eyes, and added one more thing. "Tell your readers this. You don't have to shout to be heard. You just have to mean what you say." And somewhere in a studio still echoing with silence, someone finally understood exactly what that meant. The next evening, the network scrambled to contain the fallout. Conference rooms lit up with executives, PR heads, and legal teams, tossing around phrases like brand integrity and damage control as if they could tape over a broken dam with corporate buzzwords. But the truth was already out there, raw, unedited, and impossible to spin. The host, once the face of modern satire and smug charm, had become a symbol of exactly what people were sick of. Power without empathy. Noise without meaning. Senator John Kennedy, however, wasn't chasing the news cycle. He was back in Louisiana, walking into a modest town hall filled with folding chairs and everyday people. No velvet curtains, no lighting crew, just concerned citizens who had watched something unusual unfold on national television. People came not for entertainment, but for understanding. They didn't want a viral clip. They wanted a voice that reminded them they still mattered. Kennedy stepped up to the front, sleeves rolled, no teleprompter in sight. He looked at the crowd with the same calm intensity that had frozen an entire talk show the night before. Then, he simply said, "You know, I didn't plan to go viral. I just didn't plan to disappear either." The room laughed lightly, not because it was a punchline, but because it was true. He continued, "They told me before the show, 'Try to be brief, Senator.' What they meant was, don't be real. Don't say things that might interrupt the rhythm of the entertainment machine. But here's the thing. I didn't come to entertain. I came to remind people we can talk without tearing each other apart." In the back of the room, a young woman raised her hand. "Senator, what gave you the strength to stay so calm when she was mocking you on national TV?" Kennedy paused, then smiled softly. "Because I wasn't angry at her. I was sad for all of us. Sad that we've turned compassion into a punchline and turned listening into a weakness. Staying calm wasn't strength, it was discipline. The same kind I saw in my mother when she worked double shifts to keep the lights on and never once raised her voice at the world." A man near the aisle nodded, wiping the corner of his eye. The conversation that followed was no press event. It was a healing session. One person talked about how his teenage son stopped watching the talk show entirely after seeing how Kennedy handled the confrontation. A teacher shared how she played the clip in her ethics class. A grandmother said it reminded her of a time when people disagreed without dehumanizing each other. No one talked about policy. They talked about tone, about truth, about how we speak to one another when the cameras aren't rolling. Meanwhile, across the country, something strange happened. Late-night show ratings started dropping. Not by a little, by a lot. Viewers posted clips of Kennedy with captions like, "Finally someone speaks like a grown-up," and "We need more voices like this in the noise." Even former critics began speaking out, not to defend his politics, but to defend his presence, his poise, his refusal to swing back. And then a viral remix emerged, not of the host's jokes, but of Kennedy's most poignant words, laid over music, shared by teenagers, veterans, single moms, and influencers alike. It wasn't just a soundbite, it was a spark. Back at the town hall, after the crowd dispersed, a young producer from a small independent network approached Kennedy outside. She looked nervous, holding a notepad in one hand and a phone in the other. "Senator," she began, "I left my job at that network this morning. I couldn't take part in that kind of show anymore. Watching you, it reminded me why I wanted to be a journalist in the first place, to tell the truth, not to twist it." Kennedy placed a hand gently on her shoulder and said, "Then keep doing that. The truth doesn't need a microphone, it just needs someone willing to speak it." As she walked away, a breeze passed through the trees, and for a moment the world felt still, like it was listening. That night, Kennedy sat on his porch back home, watching the stars blink silently above the Louisiana pines. He wasn't thinking about the host, the trending tags, or the headlines. He was thinking about Ava, the girl from the letter, about the waitress who quoted her father, about the college kid in the hoodie, about the former intern who leaked the truth, not out of revenge, but out of conscience. He thought about how easy it would have been to play the game, to fight snark with snark, to clap back and claim the spotlight. But he hadn't. And that made all the difference. In a time when everyone was shouting to be seen, he had whispered something unforgettable. And the world hadn't just heard him, it remembered.
By the time the weekend rolled in, the storm had become a movement. Newsrooms that had once dismissed Senator John Kennedy's quiet resolve were now dissecting every frame of his appearance, replaying the moment the host's smirk slipped into silence. Headlines had shifted from snarky clickbait to introspective questions. Has civility made a comeback? Did we just witness the death of weaponized comedy? The day's silence won. But Kennedy wasn't reading those headlines. He was at a local community center in Baton Rouge, sitting on a folding chair next to a boy named Marcus, age 13, who had just shared his dream of becoming a lawyer. "But people like me don't get that far," Marcus had said softly, avoiding eye contact. Kennedy had leaned in, hands clasped, voice low but sure. "Son, you're already further than most. You just told the truth. That's how it starts." Meanwhile, the fallout behind the scenes at the talk show continued to unravel. The host, once untouchable, was now radioactive. Sponsors not only dropped their support, but released statements distancing themselves from the show's culture of cruelty. Former staffers came forward with stories of being pressured to manufacture tension and target guests for maximum humiliation. One editor even revealed that Kennedy's pre-show briefing was intentionally misleading, designed to catch him off guard. "It was never supposed to be a fair interview," he wrote in a now viral post, but he flipped the script without lifting his voice. And then came the breaking point. An unreleased segment meant to air after Kennedy's interview was leaked. In it, the host was caught on a hot mic mocking Kennedy's appearance, voice, and grandpa energy. The crowd laughed nervously, but it wasn't just cruel. It was tired, predictable, mean. The leak shattered any defense that it had all been just jokes. That's when the network made the announcement. The show was going on hiatus, indefinitely. No fanfare, no farewell, just a quiet line on social media. "We hear you. We're taking time to reflect." And the internet, it didn't cheer for the cancellation. It didn't celebrate the downfall. Instead, it latched onto something deeper, a collective question. What do we really want to watch? People began sharing clips of Kennedy from years ago, town hall speeches, Q&A sessions, moments where he sat and listened before he spoke. A montage titled "The Senator Who Never Shouts" hit 1 million views in 2 days. Not because it was flashy, but because it was human. In an age of outrage, his restraint had become revolutionary. Kennedy's team, flooded with interview requests, turned most of them down. He wasn't interested in victory laps. He knew better than anyone that the moment wasn't about him. It was about something bigger. So instead of going on a media tour, he organized a listening session at a local high school. No cameras, no press, just students. They asked him questions, not about what had happened on the show, but about why it mattered. One girl stood up and said, "Senator, I used to think if you didn't clap back, you were weak. But now I think maybe that's the strongest thing you can do." Kennedy looked at her, eyes warm, and nodded. Sometimes silence isn't the absence of power. It's the proof that you don't need to use it to have it. After the session, a teacher approached him and whispered, "I haven't seen these kids this focused all year. You didn't just speak, you gave them something to hold on to." That night, back at home, Kennedy sat on his porch again, a worn notebook in his lap. He didn't write a speech. He wrote a letter, not for publication, not for applause, just a letter to Ava, the girl who wrote him about her school's science program. He told her everything that had happened since her letter, how her words had made it onto national television, how her story silenced a studio that was used to shouting, how a room full of strangers paused, not for anger, but for awe, and how one voice, one letter, had started something he couldn't quite explain. Then he wrote one final line. "Don't ever let them convince you that being gentle means being small. The world's loud, Ava. But the truth doesn't need to scream to shake it." He folded the letter, slipped it into an envelope, and placed it on the edge of the table as the crickets sang outside. And somewhere across the country, a host sat alone in a dressing room stripped of cameras and applause, replaying that moment when everything changed. Not because she lost a fight, but because she never realized she was in one until it was already over.
The following week, the world hadn't moved on. It had leaned in. Clips of John Kennedy's quiet confrontation were still circulating, but something deeper had begun to take root. Not just the moment itself, but the message behind it. Schools were hosting classroom discussions on public discourse. Podcasts were debating the difference between free speech and intentional humiliation. And everywhere, one question lingered like smoke after a fire. When did we start mistaking cruelty for courage? Kennedy, for his part, stayed away from the noise, not because he was ignoring it, but because he understood something most didn't. Virality is fleeting. Values are not. Instead of capitalizing on the spotlight, he spent the week meeting with local teachers, high school debate teams, and small-town leaders who never expected to get a call from a U.S. senator. But that's exactly what made the impact last. One evening, he arrived unannounced at a tiny church in Monroe, where a grief support group for veterans was being held. No cameras, no press, just folding chairs and worn hands. When one man asked why he was there, Kennedy simply replied, "Because sometimes the most important conversations happen in rooms like this, not studios." Meanwhile, the former talk show host released a formal apology video, scripted, edited, and professionally lit. She spoke about unintended offense and the importance of evolving dialogue. But the public saw right through it. The comments flooded in. "He didn't need lights to tell the truth. You still do. This isn't an apology, it's damage control." But perhaps the most liked comment said it best. "He changed the temperature of the room without raising his voice. That's the kind of power we need more of." And then, something unexpected happened. A group of students from different states organized a grassroots initiative they called the Quiet Strength Project. Inspired by Kennedy's moment on live television, they created a campaign promoting respectful conversation, listening circles, and community town halls where people were encouraged not to yell over each other, but to sit, breathe, and speak when it mattered. Kennedy was sent an email invitation to join the virtual kickoff. He showed up quietly, logged in under his full name, wearing a wrinkled Oxford shirt. No fanfare. When they asked if he had anything to say, he smiled and said, "Just this. Don't confuse silence with surrender. Sometimes it's just a man or woman waiting until the world is finally ready to hear." The students clapped, not because they were impressed, but because they felt seen, understood, validated, and in that digital space where so many voices often screamed to be heard, something rare happened. Everyone went quiet. Not out of awkwardness, but out of reverence. The world hadn't just watched a man win a viral moment. They had witnessed someone model a way of being that no longer felt common, but deeply needed. A return to grace, a refusal to perform rage, a reminder that dignity doesn't have to come wrapped in dominance. A week later, Kennedy was asked by a national outlet what he thought the biggest lesson from the whole event was. He looked into the camera for a moment, then answered, "People don't want a hero. They want a mirror. They want to see themselves in someone who isn't perfect, but still chooses to do the right thing when it would be easier not to." That night on TV, that wasn't a battle. That was a choice, to hold the line. And I think more folks out there are ready to hold it than we think. He paused. And if one young girl named Ava watches that clip and decides not to lower her voice just to fit in, then maybe, just maybe, all that noise was worth it. The interview ended. The lights dimmed, and the world kept spinning, just a little bit quieter and a whole lot clearer.